So supervised learning is pretty clear right now, right? So you give data here, and then you have labels associated with the data sets here. The labels can be categorical or can be continuous quantities. So in that case, we consider either it's classification or a regression problem. So in the model, you try to say, hey, you build a model, and then now the model receive one of the things as input here, and then generate output, and you can compare the performance to see if it's good or bad. So this is so-called unsupervised learning problem. So supervised learning problem is very well formulated, and because you can come up with a loss function, usually very well-defined loss function, to evaluate the performance of your models. Because whether you make correct prediction or incorrect prediction, and you can assess your performance in models and with your loss function relatively in a straightforward manner. And however, this is not the case for the so-called unsupervised learning. So in unsupervised learning case here, you only provide the data here, and there are no labels, no annotations of the data sets here. And they simply say, I provide you this, this set here, try to make sense of the data sets here. Very, very loosely defined. So more specifically, and usually we use notations of X and Y here in our course, right? So X represent the input data, Y represent the target values. And given X here, we build functions of models and try to output a prediction, and then we can compare that predicted value Y hat with your target values, and then by doing that, we learn our models. So in the case of unsupervised learning, so you only provide with data X here. There's no Y. So you only provide with X. You have many of those X samples of that. And then the question is this, very loosely defined, is try to make sense of these data sets here, try to identify underlying patterns of the data, and maybe map to a lower dimensional space, and then try to identify probably what is the probability distributions underlying the data X here. So you can see within the unsupervised learning paradigm, it's not clear how to even formulate the problem. It's very loosely defined. The main idea is try to understand the patterns within the data set of that. So, and for this reason, the problem is much harder than the supervised learning problem. However, unsupervised learning is extremely important. So why is that? Because right now in the machine learning, we like to formulate the problem in terms of the X and Y pairs and give you Y and then ask you to train a model to do that. However, in many real world applications here, and those annotations here, Y here, it's actually very difficult to obtain. So in many cases, you just don't have that. And for instance, in many of the scientific field, we have many X here. We do not have any idea regarding the ground truth associated with the data. And that's something we just don't know, right? Even experts don't know that. So in that case, you cannot formulate the problem as a supervised learning problem. So most of the data, so that's the reason many people argue that majority of the data in the world lie within this type of paradigm. Here you only have X without any label associated with them. But clearly those data sets here have their underlying structures. So they are not random, right? So the X relate to each other in a certain way. If we can identify underlying hidden structures, that would be very useful. So for many reasons, for instance, and for data binding, you might be able to explain what's going on here. You say one feature related to the other features here, one data is related to another feature. So give you some explanatory power, try to interpret the data sets. Instead of saying this data set here is completely random, I do not have idea regarding this data set. So provide you some knowledge regarding the underlying data sets here. So there are also some practical reasons as well. For instance, so in real world applications, it's very often that you collect data sets here, it might be possible that a subset of data sets are actually missing. It's very common in the medical domains, right? So you collect the patient data sets here, and then usually the one patient here, there's some diagnosis experiment have not been done before, so that data associated with the patient will be missing. And then the question is just, how do we handle missing data sets? Even in the case of a supervised learning problem. I don't know, have you thought about that? Suppose you have X and Y here, somebody give you many real world applications, pairs of X and Y, but it happens that for X here, there are some features are missing, right? Maybe 1 or 2 are missing. And then, so the question, how do we handle this data set? Should we throw them away? Because, I have, my algorithm requires me to provide completed information of X here, but it only tells me X1 and X3, but X2 is missing. And I cannot handle that. So in this domain here, there are multiple ways for doing that. One way is something called imputation. So first of all, before one way is to try to impute the values of X2 based on the remaining data sets of that. Then the natural question is, how do you impute this value, missing values of that? So this type of unsupervised learning can be helpful, because if you know that those data sets are related in a certain way, and then help you impute this missing data sets. And then the other possible application will be how to do a representation, represent your data sets here. And in many cases, very helpful, even for visualization purpose. You have a very high dimensional data sets here, you cannot visualize them in 10-dimensional space. And however, maybe the underlying structure here can be very even clear within a 2-dimensional space. And maybe people say, well, let's lay out the data sets in a lower dimensional space so that we can visualize them. So that will be related to something called dimension reductions of that. And the question, how do we do that? So today we're going to talk about one particular type of problem, something called a clustering problem. So in this case here, we are given a set of data sets here. We try to say, is there any way we can group those data sets into different groups based on some characteristics of that? For instance, in this example here, I provide these 3 data sets here. Maybe now clearly you can see that there is this group, natural groups of data sets, social with different data sets here. I might be able to separate data into 3 groups. And this is something called a clustering. So we're going to present this clustering algorithm. It's several of them here is, sometimes one of the most widely used unsupervised learning algorithm. Meantime, say, give me data sets here. Let's do a clustering to see if I can separate those entire data set into different groups. And then with each group, they share some commonalities. So clustering is described data by groups, and the question is, what do I mean by groups, right? So that is kind of a very loosely defined concept here, because you can define group based on the locations, right? Whether they are located near each other or not. Or you can define grouping based on shape of the distribution. Maybe it is 2 here, and you look at these 2 data sets here, they are next to each other, but they're associated with different groups of that, based on these shapes of distributions. So you might want to separate them into 2 groups, even though physically speaking, they seems to be near each other. You can also separate based on the distribution densities of the 2 groups data set. So that would be another question, which method should I use? So I'm going to talk about, in particular, 2 types of methodology here. One is very simple based on locations. Later on, we're going to talk about density related models. So this type of methodology is extremely useful for many applications, especially for scientific domains, as I mentioned that. Not so much for for nowadays for the consumer product, because many of the cases here for consumer product here, you can try to generate labels. You employ a lot of people manually annotate the data sets, so that's doable. And for scientific domains, so it's just impossible to label the data sets here because no one knows, right? Even experts do not know them or have knowledge of that. It's just impossible. And so, for instance, one of the widely used applications of clustering algorithm is related to something called the gene expression analysis in biology. So nowadays, biologists can measure, the gene expressions of genes simultaneously for all of them in one shot, in one experiment. And for instance, you might want to say, plot the expressions of genes here across different experimental conditions or different types of cells, right? So many different experiments. And each row here will represent the expression of that gene across that different experiments. But now we know that any organism have many genes of that. Humans will have 20,000 genes. So you can somewhat plot these genes here, represent them with this matrix representation. So each row represents 1 gene, each column represents 1 experiment, 1 conditions. something like that. So you can, so now in this case here, a lot of biologists like to do here is once they generate this type of data sets here, and the question is, can I discover underlying patterns of the data sets here, providing me some scientific discovery? Well, one thing they will do right away is doing something called clustering. They cluster those genes and cluster those experiments jointly, and then afterwards, the patterns emerges, right? You can see that. Well, there are this group of genes that show very clearly similar patterns of activities here, and then the other set of genes showing another patterns. So that type of information is very informative because it can tell biologists right away, say, well, go look closely at those type of genes here. They somewhat show very clear patterns relate to each other. So then they can go to the lab doing more experiments. So that not just for scientific knowledge, and apply in many other domains as well. For instance, you can cluster the pictures together based on features of that. And then, so next I'm going to talk about one of the most popular clustering algorithms, so something called a K-means algorithm for doing clustering. I'll talk about. It's pretty straightforward, so I'll go very quickly. So K-means clustering algorithm is a very relatively straightforward clustering algorithm. It's an iterative algorithm. I should say it started iterative algorithm. So it iterates between two steps. So it's highlighted in this tab here. The first step is something called updated the assignment data to clusters. And the second step is update the cluster's summary information. So in this case here, so illustrate this this algorithm in a two-dimensional space. I have these green dots here, these original dots here. So what we have here is this, we're gonna assign each of the samples here to cluster. And how do we assign sample to cluster? Well, what are we gonna do here is this, we're gonna define, first of all, you should be clear the data sets here. Each data has these features here, x sub I, we talked about previously, is an n-dimensional vector. So here is two-dimensional, okay? So now we assume those data sets here can be grouped into k clusters. For instance, let's choose k equal to 3. So to make this assumption here, say these data sets can be grouped into 3 clusters here. The question is, how do we group them? So what are we gonna do here is this, we're gonna associate with each cluster with a parameter, something called a center. What is the center of this cluster here? So these are 3 sets of parameters, mu1, mu2, and mu3. So these are the centers associated with each one of the k clusters. In this case, k equal to 3. And then, so that's the parameters of your K-means algorithm. So initially, those centers are randomly assigned. So you randomly assign these k centers here. And next, you're going to update those membership assignment. And then next, you update the center information. So that this algorithm will do it. So let's see how this algorithm is doing here, okay? So this illustrates this example in a two-dimensional space. So now you have a set of samples here, and this data set is in two-dimensional here, and you can measure the distance between each pairs of data sets here, right? So we start with, so we run this K-means algorithm by start with random initialization. So that will be initialize the center location of that. So I'm going to say, well, the center located here, randomly pick up 3 dots here, say these are the centers of the cluster. So I represent them with different colors here. This is the red cluster, and the purple cluster, blue cluster here. And these are the center, mu1, mu2, mu3. Okay, so this is the first step of iteration. The next step this is the first step, is random initialization. So then I'm going to run iteration. The first step of iteration is so-called membership assignment. So I have a blue, green, and a purple cluster. As next say, for each one of the samples here, I'm going to assign that to one of this cluster here. You're going to associate this dot either to blue, either to red or purple here. How do I associate them? Well, I'm going to assign based on the ones that has closest to this, center that's close to these samples here. If I look at this sample here, which one is closest to this sample? Well, certainly is the blue center here. So that's the reason I'm going to assign this dot to be blue. Similarly, for the other dots here, for instance, this dot here, I look around here, which center is closer to this data samples here? I found, oh, it's purple center. It's close to this one. So I'm going to label this data set to be purple. And that's pretty clear. And then look at this ones here. Oh, this one I had to think about because I need to do some calculation to calculate what's the distance to this one or the distance to this one. And now I find this is closer to this one. So I'm going to assign this one to be red. So by doing that, you assign colors to each one of the samples and one of the 3 different colors of that. So all of them here are assigned to the blue cluster because they are closer to the center of the blue here. All these guys, 2 dots here, assigned to the red cluster because they're close to this sample here. And these are the purple ones here. And that will be this is the first step of iteration. This is called a membership assignment, determine the membership of each training sample. The membership is simply say which cluster it belongs to. So in implementation, we typically give a numerical number associated with the clusters. You might want to call this blue to be 1, red to be 2, purple to be 3 here. And you say all these guys here assign a membership 1, all of these guys here assign a membership 2, and these guys here assign membership 3. Right? So this is so-called a membership assignment. So then once I'm done with finish this step, I go to the next step. The next step is to update the centers of the cluster. Because you can clearly see now, this center here is not representative of the samples here anymore. Because if I look at all these data sets here, I found that center might be located somewhere here. I need to shift this center of that. So that is the job of the second step of iteration, is so-called update the cluster center. So by doing that, I take the center of the gravity. So in the K-means algorithm, it simply take the mean values of all the blue dots here. So you see that blue dots have these X values. I simply take the mean values of blue dots here and move and assign the center to the mean values of all samples associated with this cluster. By doing that, my cluster moved to this location. Similarly, you update the cluster of the blue dots, blue cluster, update the center of the purple cluster. And so that finishes the second step of iteration. Now I'm going to run another iteration because given now I have a new center here, and the question I ask myself, do I need to update the membership assignment? Well, in some cases, you might need to update the membership assignment again because what? Because I look at these dots here. So this is the blue dots. Previously was assigned to the blue cluster here. But now, once you have a new center here, because once you update the center, you push the center away from that dots here. So now this blue sample, now is getting closer to red samples, red cluster here. So, well, if I look at that, I will assign membership to red instead of blue. And that's what I'm going to do here. I go over all the samples here and then update the membership. I can do that. The only thing I need to update is these samples here. Remaining them seems to be okay. Okay, once I update the membership here, and then I'm going to update the cluster, center cluster again. So I can shift that. Now we have center of the cluster here. And after that, I'm going to check that again to see if I need to update the membership assignment. So in this case, and you are done. So the algorithm will converge because there's no update anymore. Because once I have this cluster center here, it doesn't seem like I need to update any membership here. They all seems to be finalized. There's no need to, oh, is that right? I'm sorry, I made a mistake here. In fact, this algorithm saying that this actually closer to this one's here. And maybe the diagram didn't draw correctly here, but this one closer. So now I'm going to assign this red here. So then afterwards, I've updated center. So now I think I'm done now. I do not need no changes, so which means the algorithm will converge. So that is the so-called K-means algorithm. So let's summarize again. So the algorithm iterate until convergence within the 2 steps of that. The first step is this membership assignment. So in this case here, I use this variable z sub I to denote the cluster membership. So typically this is the integer. So we can associate it with the integer number associated with 1 to k, associated with this k cluster of that. And that's simply saying among all the center indices here, so mu c is the index of the centers here. C goes from 1 to k here. Essentially, given given a specific sample, x sub I here, I samples. And by the way, this is the index of the samples. Previously, we usually put this I here to be parentheses and superscript here, but in this notation, it uses a subscript here. I just want to point out, this is the x sub I itself is a vector here, just represent these features associated with the I samples. And then we'll calculate distance using this L2 Euclidean norm here to calculate distance between x sub I sample to the C center, cluster centers. And I'm gonna go over all the C different clusters with C goes from 1 to K, and I'm gonna pick up the one that is closest to x sub I. And that will be its membership assignment. So that will be Z sub I. Z sub I essentially which cluster was associated with this I samples back. So Z sub I will go, the values of Z sub I is integer, goes from either 1 or to K. So that is this membership assignment. And the next is to update the centers. So once I have the membership assignment, and then I take I recalculate the center by calculating the mean values of all the samples associated with that centers. So in mathematically speaking was written in this case here. So I'm gonna SC here represent all the data associated with the cluster C. So that will be a set of samples associated with cluster C. I take an average of all the samples here, divided by total number of them. So that is the mean values associated with this cluster. And that is so-called center of that cluster. And then once I have updated center here, I can go back here and update the membership assignment. So that's called K-means algorithm. So the algorithm has interesting properties. The algorithm, you can prove that it will converge within a finite number of steps. So that is very different from the other algorithm we talk about, because all the algorithms we talk about, for primarily gradient descent algorithm, they are, as we mentioned, they will asymptotically approach your solutions. And but there's no guarantee they will converge within a finite number of steps. Well, unless you put that thresholding function there. But this K-means algorithm, you can prove that it always, you don't need to set a stopping criteria. Stopping criteria simply say there's no changes, and then you stop your algorithm. So that, however, you can prove that the algorithm will guarantee that will not go cycles, right? So one thing you might worry about that, once I do this iteration here, maybe go cycle and then update it next time, not back and forth, and the algorithm will not stop. But however, you can prove that that is not the case. The algorithm is guaranteed to converge within a finite number of steps. The reason that is the case because you can interpret this K-means algorithm is simply by minimizing this loss function or cost function here. So this is a cost function measures something like this. Measures the, for each data set here, and minus its associated centers and the calculate distance between them here, and summation over samples of that. Essentially measures the concept, say how, once you make this membership assignment, once you determine the center clusters, and then this right-hand side here measures how tight is your data sets here. Essentially, how tight means that, and how tight is your each individual sample associated with this individual center clusters there. And of course, the tighter, the better. The tighter means that you separate them clearly into different clusters. Each cluster is very tightly connected to each other. And that means this loss will be very small. So you can show that the two iterations I mentioned previously is simply, you can think about it as one methodology of solving this minimization problem. So in this case here, in this loss function, you have two sets of variables. One is this membership assignment. So that is Z variable. And the other one is the center cluster. This is another set of variable. You can see that I need to determine the membership assignment and the center cluster. And for these two sets of variables, and that minimize this so-called tightness of your loss function. And then that is the solution to your K-means algorithm. It turns out that the previous two steps of iteration here is simply one particular methodology for solving this loss function here, minimize this optimization problem. And in particular, you can view them as a particular method called coordinate descent methodology. So in the coordinate descent is one of the generic methods for solving optimization problem. So in this method here, what do you do here? Well, because you have two sets of variables here, z and mu, well, it's very hard to minimize them, jointly, because the reason is this. In this case here, z is a discrete variable, so we cannot apply gradient descent methodology for solving that. That just cannot do that. And now, however, what we can do is this. We can use so-called coordinate descent. What we can do is that let's fix mu here, and then minimize z, and then fix z, minimize mu, and then do this alternate with each other. And again, actually, you can prove that if I fix mu, minimize z, and that is actually membership assignment, what we talked about previously. That will give you the optimal solutions with z. And then on the other hand, if you fix z and then try to optimize parameter mu, you can see that this is the center cluster will give you the optimal solution for solving the second problem here. So once you understand that, you can see that, well, this algorithm will have to converge because every step here minimize these loss functions. So you have to converge after final step. All right. So there's a few issues we need to think about it. This. So this algorithm here, what we can do is you can think about this, right? So it's an iterative algorithm here. And however, there's one thing is actually tricky, is that we start with random initialization. And it turned out that this algorithm, this function here is not convex anymore. So which means depends on how your data sets are initialized, how your membership, how your centers are initialized, and then it actually might give you different solutions. In fact, will give you different solutions. So now it matters, the question is, well, how do I choose the best one, the globally optimal solution? So that involves some of the heuristics. But typically, you need to run those k-means clustering algorithm multiple times, try with different sets of initialization. So in the end, you have different sets of initialization, you get your solutions, and then you can calculate this loss here, right? Calculate this cost function. And in the end, you can compare this cost function by using the ones that give you the smallest values. And you use that as your k-means algorithm. So that is illustrated here. You can see that. So this is data sets here. And this is a result of k-means algorithm with different sets of initializations here. And this is one way of k-means results. And this is another of k-means results here. You can see here is this. So this time you fix the k here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So every time it give you 4 clusters here. But that cluster actually have different results here. So the main difference here is this. So in these examples here, so you view these data sets as one group, right? One group. But you split these two groups here, right? You split this group as two groups here, but view them as one group. So conversely, this is a different solution. So this solution here, you split these data sets here into two groups, but then you merge them into one group here. And the question, which one is better? Well, in order to do that, you can go back here, calculate this overall loss function to see which one is tighter. And turns out this one is tighter in terms of the overall loss. And then in the end, we say, well, I'm going to choose this solution instead of this one. And so there is also some other way, clever methodology in terms of doing initialization. Right now, we say what you can do, you can randomly assign clusters here. And typically, people say, just randomly, suppose I want to generate 4 clusters here. What you can do, you randomly pick up the k samples and you use that samples, the x values of that sample as your initial centers. So that's called random initialization. So however, this type of initialization is not the optimal way. The better way, there are some better ways. So this is one way of doing that, something called a distance-based initialization. So in this methodology here, what do you do here is this. You start with the one here, and then you try to go, this is the center of your first cluster, and then to determine the center of the next cluster, you try to go as far as possible. You try to find the data that's further away from this one. And you say, this is my new cluster. So the reason for doing that, you say, I'm going to push the cluster away from each other. So this hopefully, by generating, try to separate those groups as much as possible. Because this random initialization is very, it's possible that once you random initialize them, all the centers here are located here. There's a small chance for doing that. So as a result, you can see that your algorithm might try to separate this group here, but instead merge everything else together. So that seems like a good solution. And of course, if you're doing this method here, there's also disadvantages associated with this sort of distance-based way of doing random initialization. So it tends to be more sensitive to the outliers. Yeah. So people handle that by kind of doing this combined with random here. You say, given this data sets here, I randomly choose these guys here, but based on some sampling methodology. So I'm not choose the furthest point here, but try to sample from a collection of data sets here. So there's a different random initialization methodology. I just want to point out because you just need to be aware that when you run k-means algorithm, so they are sensitive to your initialization. So it's always good to try different sets of initialization. In the end, pick up the best solutions for that. All right, so that's so-called k-means algorithm here. So next set of algorithm, clustering algorithm, I want to mention is something called a agglomerative clustering algorithm. So this is different from the k-means algorithm. So this is method here is also very commonly used in the clustering community. Because it's very straightforward. It uses something like this. You start with these data sets here, and then you try to build up this kind of a hierarchical organizations of data sets here by putting them into a tree structure. And then you start from the bottom. You say all the data sets here, they are each individual is a cluster. So you start with n data sets here, you start with n cluster here. And then you gradually merge samples here. And then in the end, you build up from the bottom to the end, you merge everything together. So that is so-called agglomerative clustering here, and by building a dendrogram. So let me show you an example. How do we do this one here, right? So this is examples here. You start with this data sets here. And initially, everything is, each data set have its own cluster of that. So what you can do here, you start by merge data set, one pair at a time. So how do you merge them? Well, among all the data sets here, what do? You pick up the 2 data points that are closest to each other. Among all the sets here, which pairs of data sets are close to each other? And for that purpose, you need to calculate all the pairwise distance between them. In the end, determine the pairs that's close to each other. Well, look at them here. These red pairs are most similar, most close to each other. And then you say, by doing that, well, I'm going to merge these 2 here, merge them into a single cluster. And merge them and treat them, say this is one cluster now. And then typically what we do, we draw this type of dendrogram here. And then so you put these guys here, and then the height of the dendrogram here relate to the similarity between these 2 data sets here. So typically that similarity you can calculate based on, for instance, Euclidean distance between these data sets here, and this height of this curves here will be equivalent to, will be proportional to the Euclidean distance between these 2 data sets here. Okay, so that's the first iteration. You pick up these 2 pairs of samples here and then merge them. So after you merge them, you treat them as one unit here. And then what you do here is you recalculate all the pairwise distance between this n-1 clusters. The reason is n-1 because you already merged 2 of them and treat them as one unit. So you have to calculate pairwise distance between them. So we're going to talk about how do we calculate pairwise distance between this sample and a cluster here. But suppose there's a way to calculate the distance between this cluster and other sample or other cluster. And then what you can do, you can pick up the closest one and then merge them again. So for instance, in the second step, you find that these 2 pairs of samples are closest to each other, and then you merge them. And again, use this height here represent the similarity between the samples here, because this one, the previous one is more similar to this one. So obviously this guy is going to be higher than this red vertical lines here. So that would be the second pairs of sample. So now you merge another pairs. So overall you have n-2 samples. And then you repeat the process. So the process next thing you see is interesting. Now you say, previously I have this one unit. This is within this unit, there are 2 samples here. And for some reason I have a metric here to calculate distance between this one and this unit here. And it turns out this guy here is closest in all the pairs of comparison. So what we do next is to merge these dots with these 2 red dots here. And that was showing up here. So you're going to merge this one with this guy's here. So and so on. So by doing that, you can do this repeatedly. So if you repeat this until, okay, in the end, now at this stage here, you merge a lot of things, now only have 3 clusters remaining. Suppose that's the case. And that was represented in this case here. You have blue, red, and purple here. So next, I'm going to try to finish up the final steps of building up the dendrogram. So among the 3 here, you calculate all the pairwise distance between them. So again, so I'm going to show you later, just shortly, tell you how to calculate pairwise distance between these 2 cluster of data points here. So certainly that needs definition, right? So, but suppose you know how to do that. So now you're going to pick up the the most similar ones here, and then you connect them. Suppose these 2 are most similar, so now you connect those ones here based on this guy height represent the similarity between them here. And now you say this merged into 1 cluster, and then similarly you can finish up the remaining ones and connect the remaining ones here. So by doing that, what I just illustrated here is we build up this kind of hierarchical representations of the data sets here by merging 1 pair at a time, 1 pair at a time. But in the end, once you merge 1 pair at a time, in the end, you're going to merge to everything merged together to be a single cluster. And the way of doing this, you're going to generate so-called a dendrogram. So once you have the dendrogram, and you can generate clusters by cut along these branches here, horizontally cut them here. And you can choose to generate multiple clusters by cut at different locations. If you cut at here, and now you will be able to generate 3 clusters, right? You have 1 cluster here, and then second cluster here, and third cluster here. And however, suppose you decide to cut at this location here. So now how many clusters you generate? You're going to generate 4 clusters here. 2 here, one cluster, second cluster, third, fourth here. And you can suppose you decide to generate clusters this way, you're going to generate more clusters of that. So the dendrogram doesn't actually give you a specific clusters here, because that's really easy in a byproduct of this dendrogram here. But the dendrogram itself is already provides lots of information in terms of which data is more closer to each one, which one is further away from the others. So that is very informative for doing that. All right, so there's one thing remaining item I have not talked about is how do you calculate the distance between 2 clusters? Because once you merge those data samples here, I need a metric to calculate distance between clusters. So otherwise, I cannot merge anymore, right? So there are multiple ways for doing that. So here I listed the 4 common methodology for calculating the distance between 2 clusters. And so they are all used in real practice. So in your particular application, you have to pick up one methodology from the 4 here. But let me just first explain what are these 4 methodologies here. The first methodology illustrated in this right-hand side here is something called a single linkage methodology. So suppose you have the red dot associated with 1 cluster, blue dot associated with another cluster here, and then cross represent the center of each cluster here, right? So the distance between this cluster here, based on single linkage here, is essentially say, what is the shortest distance between two samples, one from 1 cluster, the second sample from the second cluster of that. The shortest distance between these pairs of the sample, and you can see this is the shortest distance between these 2 clusters here. And so that's called a single linkage methodology. So in this method here, you have to cycle through all the pairs between these 2 clusters, and then use the one that has the shortest distance between these 2 pairs of that. That's so-called a single linkage methodology. So conversely, you might ask, why do I pick up the shortest distance? Why didn't I pick up the larger distance between the 2 clusters? Well, that's also a reasonable choice. That is called a complete linkage. So in the complete linkage here, it's opposite to the single linkage methodology. Essentially, I pick up 2 extreme points here, one from red cluster, one from the blue cluster, and the 2 data points are furthest away from each other. And use this distance as a metric of distance between these 2 clusters. So that's called a complete linkage methodology. So of course, and then there's another method I may just say, well, instead we calculate this, shortest or the furthest distance here, or I can calculate all pairwise distance and take an average between them here. So this is this metric here is called average metric, right? So in that case, you're going to have to calculate all pairwise distance between these two clusters and then take an average of them here. And then the first one is simply the distance between the centroid of the two clusters. So this cluster right here, I have centroid here, blue dots I have centroid here, and then this first method is simply calculate the distance between the two centers. And that is easy to calculate. So these are the four common methodology for calculating distance between two different clusters. So clearly you would imagine that those different metrics here will give you different dendrogram. That is indeed the case. Let me show you one example of that. For instance, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8 samples here. 8 samples here, right? And suppose I use the single linkage methodology to calculate the distance between centers, between clusters, and these will be the groupings, in the groupings of the hierarchical clustering algorithm. So you group these two first, and then this second, and then you group these guys here. So these are all four will be grouped in the very beginning. But next thing is this: how do you group between clusters? And if you are using single linkage as the distance metric between two clusters, you can look at it here. What's the distance between this cluster and this cluster? Well, so that would be distance between these two data points here. And now if you compare distance between these two clusters right here, what is the distance between them? Well, that would be this distance here. Clearly, this is shorter. So that's when you group this first, and then group this next, and then in the end doing this way. So this will be a hierarchical clustering result based on single linkage metric. On the other hand, suppose I'm going to use complete linkage here. So that will give you a different result. So why is that? Well, if I look at this two cluster here, so what is the distance between these two here based on the complete linkage? So that would be the maximal distance between the two here. So that would be the distance, these pairs of the samples give you the distance between these two clusters here. But now if we look at the distance between these two horizontal clusters here, what is the distance? Well, now you have to look at two further away points here. So that would be between this data point to this one here. You can see clearly that is bigger than this pairs of cluster here. So that's why you're going to group these guys first. And you can see that it gives you different dendrograms. So you can see now, so the single linkage will give you a different solution from complete. And the question is, which one should I use in practice? So this something is a hard question to answer. You have to kind of look at your particular applications and then choose which one that works better for you. So it's unfortunate. All right. So in summary, what I talk about so far is this, two simple, two very classical clustering algorithms. One is based on k-means clustering, and the other one is based on the so-called hierarchical clustering algorithm. So these two algorithms is good. However, they're all based on solve the problem I mentioned at the very beginning here. And now the question is, how do you define the cluster? So right now, the clusters are defined more or less based on the distance between data points, and then based on locations. So in many other cases, location does not tell the complete story. So one example is show up in this case here. And suppose you have this data sets here, red dot data sets here, and mixed together in like this guys here. So now you look at it here, and suppose I want to cluster these data sets here into two groups. How do I cluster them? Well, if you use k-means clustering here, you have to make a hard choice, cut them here, say left side, right side here in some way. And however, they will not give you the right solution because the clustering is the emerge somewhat based on distributions of data sets here, instead of the clear distance between them. So based on here, I can roughly say there's one cluster is somewhat distributed like this way. There's another one in a cluster this way. And now it seems like the better way of determining the clustering properties. And however, in order to think about this way, there are a few things I need to have to address that were not addressed previously. First of all, in this case here, the data sets in the center here, they can be assigned to either cluster. Can be assigned to this one, can assign to the other one. So this is not the case for the two algorithms we talked about so far, because in that case, one dataset can only be assigned to one cluster. They cannot be shared. So you have to make a hard decision. And in this case here, I cannot, right? So the dataset here can be assigned to cluster. And the question, how do we do that? So for that purpose here, we're going to talk about one methodology. And this is a very powerful methodology here. It's something called a mixture model. So in particular, I'm going to talk about something called a Gaussian mixture models here. So that comes back to the core part of the many part of the machine learning here. It's a very powerful kind of paradigm for think about this type of problem. So the idea is this, well, what is the unsupervised learning problem? Well, maybe the right way to think about this unsupervised learning is try to model the probability distributions of your data point. Because if you can model the probability distribution of your data, and then now provide you very powerful methodology to think about the underlying patterns of data sets here. And first of all, the distribution contains the underlying structure. The structure will reveal itself. The secondly, once you know the probability distribution, in fact, you can actually generate new samples, new data sets, look similar to your training data sets here. And for that reason, you can come up with something called a generative models. So in that generative model, not only you have good understanding data sets here, but I can produce a new samples that looks very similar to the collections of training sample you have. And that's very useful in many applications here. So this paradigm is a very extremely powerful methodology here. So for instance, let's take about one of the simple possible applications here. And let's say I'm going to model some of my data here is a continuous variables here, and I can model them with a normal distribution, Gaussian distributions. So for instance, suppose I will take an illustration here. Suppose I have the samples here, some of them kind of more close to here, another sample cluster here, another sample cluster here. Maybe the right way I can do here, I can model them with a Gaussian distribution. However, if I model with Gaussian distribution, we know that Gaussian distribution has single mode. It's going to be centered at one location. But look at it here, it doesn't seem like centered at one particular location, and maybe centered on multiple locations. And how do we do that? Well, to address this multi-mode distribution, and then we can say, well, maybe I use multiple Gaussian to model these distributions here. And that's the reason we have the so-called mixture of Gaussian here. So for instance, I maybe say, I'm going to model the distribution with 3 Gaussians here. And now I'm going to say this distribution now have multi-mode. One mode is here, another mode is here, another mode here. The center of the mode might be corresponding the center of your cluster, something like that. All right. If you think about this way, more generically speaking, you're saying this, I'm going to model the probability distributions of X here using a mixture of normally distributed distributions here, and here stands for the density functions of the normal distribution, the Gaussian distribution. That's density functions here. And remember that that's exponentials of the functions of that. And that, however, with each Gaussian distribution, I have a set of variables. One is the center, the other one is covariance, standard deviation, and there's another set of parameters. Pi here will be the weight, right? Well, how much weight I should assign to each individual Gaussian random variables. So that would be in this one-dimensional distribution. So in more generally, in the multi-dimensional distribution, we have to model the data sets here using the so-called multivariate Gaussian distribution. That's what we talked previously. So in that case, what happens is for each Gaussian distribution here, we need two sets of variables. One is the center, mu here, the center of the distribution. The other one is so-called covariance matrix. So this is more important here because covariance matrix tells you what is the shape of the distribution of that. And so suppose we want to model, a mixture of Gaussian models here with 2 sets of variables here. One is the mean, the other one is covariance matrix here. The other one is the weight parameter associated with each Gaussian distribution. And this is 3 sets of variables. And in the end, we need to estimate these 3 sets of variables here based on that given data set. And how do we estimate? Well, we estimate based on how to see how good is my data fit to this distribution here. and then in terms of goodness of fit, and then we can measure in terms of so-called likelihood function. And we talked about previously. Essentially, what this means, well, give me plot a data from my training sample here. I'm going to plug in this formula here and then calculate the number. And then ideally, I like this overall number to be large. And however, you have to combine all the m samples here. And then essentially, what I'm going to say here, we'll calculate log of likelihood of all the samples of that, and then take an average over all the samples. So now I have a loss function, and I want to maximize this log likelihood function with respect to this set of parameters here. And then the question in the end is just formulated as an optimization problem. Well, so how do you solve this optimization problem? So what you can apply gradient descent methodology to do that. That's certainly a reasonable approach. However, there's actually a much more efficient methodology for solving that optimization problem. So that's something called EM algorithm, called expectation maximization algorithm. So I'm going to go this very quickly because it's very intuitive here. So in this algorithm here, again, so it's an iterative algorithm. We start with a set of random initialization, and then later on we try to update those parameters. So random initialization in this case here, the parameter I need to optimize is the mean variable. So mean is the center associated with each cluster. That would be mean associated with each Gaussian distribution. And then there's this covariance matrix associated with each Gaussian distribution. And there's this pi c here, this weight parameter associated with each Gaussian here. And so in this case, we assume the number of Gaussians is fixed, k is fixed. Think about it, k equal to 3, right? 3 clusters. Right? So then I'm going to run this so-called expectation step. So in this expectation step, what is essentially is a membership assignment, like what we have in the k-means algorithm. However, in this case here, the membership assignment is not a hard assignment anymore. It actually is something called a soft assignment. Essentially, I assign in terms of probability here. So what do I mean here is this. So given the data sets here, and I'm going to calculate the so-called R sub IC here. So for the I sample, so that's where you have index I here. C is this, what is the probability of assign cluster C to this I samples of that? And this values what depends on how close is your data to the center of these clusters here, right? And however, in this case here, the closeness is not measured in terms of Euclidean distance anymore, but instead in terms of how good is this your I data sets here fit to that normal distributions. And then so that's slightly more complicated because what depends not only mu here, but also the covariance matrix associated with that cluster of that. But overall, you can calculate this probability distributions of this I under that C normal distribution there. And then you have to multiply another constant here, this pi c here. So pi c is essentially the weight parameter associated with the different clusters of that. So that be product of between these two numbers here. So these two numbers here tells you what is this weight here you should be assigned to this cluster C. And then in order to make it to be a probability distribution, and then you properly normalize them here. And that's pretty straightforward. And then you calculate numbers here, and then you sum over this number, sum over different C, and then to properly normalize such that RIC becomes a probability distribution with number between 0 and 1. So that's what it means here, this denominator, what it means, it's a normalization factor. But what's important here is this part here. And how much you should assign the cluster C to this data set here. Well, it depends on distribution here. The higher the density, you should more assign to this C here. And then it depends on pi C here. Because if you weight that cluster more, you assign more weight to that. And this illustrated in this side here, you have two probability distributions. And then this sample 0, under this distribution here, you have this R1 to be R2 here to be 0.66. And the second distribution, you look at this values here and this values here. So smaller, that would be 0.33. So you can assign weights different than them here. So this step here is equivalent to the membership assignment under the k-means clustering algorithm. However, the key difference here is I do not have a hard assignment anymore. The here assignment is in terms of probability sense. In what probability that you associate cluster C to data set I here. So each sample, each cluster have a number associated. It's just that some clusters have a smaller number, some clusters have a high number. And those numbers are between 0 and 1. So this is so-called expectation step. And now you go to the second step, and now the second step is very similar to the second step of K-means scenario. In that case, we updated the center and parameters. So in our case, those K-means centers, K-means algorithm here, there are parameters of K-mean that will be the center of the K-mean and then the normal distribution, and what's the covariance matrix of that. And that turns out to be mean is the same here. You update the average of the data sets social with the center here. However, in this case here, there's no hard assignment, right? You cannot simply say this 2, 3, 4 data sets social with this center C here. However, in the end, we still have summation over all samples, but it's going to be weighted by these cluster assignment from the previous steps of that, weighted by R sub C here. So that essentially say how much this I sample here contribute to the C center here. And because this, if the I sample is more social with center C, it weighted more here. So that is this weighted by this membership assignment. So that's the mu C parameter. Similarly, you can calculate the covariance matrix in this similar fashion. So then the algorithm iterated between this expectation maximization steps of that. So let me show you the, I'm running out of time here. Let me show you the final example of that. So this shows you one example of the K-means clustering algorithm. Here you can see now the data sets here, it's not clear. What are the cluster of this data set? It's more subtle, right? And suppose I randomly initialize 2 clusters, and that will be in terms of 2 normal distributions here, initially randomly distributed with this shape here. So shape will be determined by the covariance matrix. Center will depend by the mu parameters. And now we're going to update them here. You can see a slightly shift. Now we're going to shift this center here, and also update the shape of the distribution, shape of the ellipsoid here. And so in the end, the algorithm will converge the solution here. It's saying that this data sets here can be modeled by the mixture of 2 Gaussian distributions. All right. So I'm running a bit of time here. Let me actually, I'm going to